Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Fighting for the Soul of General Practice, the podcast where we explore the key challenges and emerging areas shaping healthcare and general practice today. My name is James Campbell, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-hosts, Dr. Rupal, Shah, and Dr. Jens Foell. Jens, great to have you on. Good to see you as always.
Hello.
How's it going?
Lovely to see you, James.
Well, I'm very excited to say that today we're going to welcome two inspiring guests whose work speaks directly to some of the most urgent and hopeful developments, I think, in healthcare. Dr. Paquita de Zulueta, a UK-based GP and academic, and of course an advocate for compassionate, values-based medicine, and Dr. Jane Myat, a clinician and educator committed to fostering relational and reflective practice. Today, we're going to talk and focus on some of the key issues around this notion of Era 3 and Era 3 in healthcare, sometimes called the moral era, a term coined by Don Berwick and has been talked about by many other people, including Paquita. And it's great to have you guys on as guests today. But to begin with, a lot of our listeners, they might not necessarily know who you both are, nor will they necessarily know what Era 3 is. So we're going to get into that in a second. But to begin with, I'll start with you, Jane. Could you just tell us who you are, what's your current role, and what are your kind of research interests?
So I'm Jane Myat. I was a GP at the Caversham Group Practice, a partner there for 27 years until last September. So I've been describing myself since then as a GP in recovery because I'm not entirely sure who I am anymore. And I guess I'm not a formal researcher, but I feel like I've been a field worker. So doing action research by being on the ground, a bit worm-like and, channeling the same patch of land and getting to know my people and burrowing deeply and doing various different things. And about 10 years ago, I was burning out in the system. I felt that things didn't make sense to me and I was going to leave. And instead, I ended up starting a community garden at the practice and working very differently with my patients. And then that has led to all sorts of other adventures, cooking with patients, doing walks, darning and repairing in waiting rooms and all sorts of other things. And I guess I'm currently involved in a variety of different projects, some with the College of Medicine, some elsewhere.
Okay, well, thanks, Jane. I love the earthworm analogy as well. That's a great place to start a conversation on these topics, I think. And Paquita, can you just give us a little introduction? So who you are, what's your kind of current role and your research interests?
Yes, so I'm a retired GP. I was an inner city GP in London for 38 years, and I specialized in migrant and refugee health. I worked as a volunteer for Doctors of the World, their London clinic, for about 10 years. I also specialized in mental health and qualified in CBT, and then sort of went on to incorporate compassion-focused therapy and mindfulness, and that has been for me very rewarding. So I was part-time GP, part-time therapist, and also I'm a coach and mentor mainly for doctors, which is another way of helping to support the profession. And I'm chair of a charity called the Human Values in Healthcare Forum, which has been going as a charity for about 3 years, but prior to it really actually was started up and founded in the 1980s. So I can say more about that later. So my research interests are very much about compassionate leadership, compassion in healthcare, but also some ethical issues as well. I write about, because I didn't mention that actually I'm also a clinical ethicist and an honorary senior lecturer at Imperial College. So I teach and write about ethics, and I'm in various ethics committees. So I'm a bit of a butterfly, as you can tell, lots of things. So that's it. And I'm actually hoping to do some research on touch in the context of general practice and how GPs feel about touch, because I feel that's a dimension that is getting very much lost and is very important in the healthcare context for relational care. So my interest is in relational care as well.
Fascinating. Well, that sounds like a few topics there that we can get into a bit deeper later on as well. But thank you both very much for your time. And it's wonderful to have two people with such a diverse range of interests and expertise, as well as practical, relational and theoretical perspectives on these topics too. But, some of this is a little theoretical. We have this Era 1, this Era 2, and this Era 3, and they've come up a few times in different podcasts and conversations that we've had, and I know that they're in the book as well. So, Ru, I'm going to hand over to you, and could you just very, very briefly just explain to us some of the key differences between era 1, era 2, and what is this sort of era 3 that, as far as I'm aware, is kind of more of an aspirational mode that we're transitioning into rather than a place we're already at. But Ruth, could you just tell us a little bit about the 3 different eras, and so our general listeners might have a better understanding of what we're going on about today?
Absolutely, James. So era 1 was prevalent when I was at medical school and as a junior doctor, and it was kind of the era when the doctor was God. And I'm going to say doctors specifically, because I think it was like that culturally. And I think sometimes these senior doctors were benevolent dictators, but sometimes, unfortunately, they really weren't. And I have seen really terrible examples of practice as well as astonishing examples. So I think you had that. And there was a lot of protectionism as well, you know, kind of like safeguarding our profession. And then you had, I suppose, lots of societal changes, as well as high profile cases like Harold Shipman, for example. So one way or another, we moved into era 2, as Don Berwick describes it, which is an era of reductionism, where everything is about targets and outputs and measurement and breaking things down. And that's where we are now. And as you say, era 3 is an aspirational era, and you could frame it as a moral era, where we're kind of rejecting protectionism and reductionism and moving towards something that's better and more nourishing.
Okay. And in all of your opinions, do you feel like this era 3, as it's been highlighted so far, is where we want to be heading? Is this a transition that you all agree we should be moving towards?
I think transitions are always very messy and things are always changing. So I don't think it's that we have a choice in it. I think we can see in the world at the moment that everything is changing and things are moving in all sorts of different directions. And so I guess it's choosing how we want to respond to all that complexity and chaos, and giving up the idea that we might have this control.
Jens, I'll go to you, please.
The focus is relational care for me, and personally I think we are at the same time in some relations in era 1, and that might be a good thing. In others, era 1, that might be a bad thing. Definitely era 2, that is managerial overreach. Everything needs to be counted, data driven, feeding the data monster. And era 3 is in partially there already. There are some patient relations which are fantastic, and we moved from face to face to side by side, where in other relationships it's different. So I'm hopeful that we find ways of embracing relational care, but I'm at the same time very skeptical about how would this look like, and what language do we need to employ to nurture this plant.
And Paquita, how about yourself? Do you have any things to share on that? Any concerns, or is this simply a great thing we need to do?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think quite a lot of what's going on. I mean, there is a shift. It's quite clear that this, if you like, era 2 isn't really working, that it's causing a great deal of unnecessary distress in the system and to individuals, both patients and those that care for them. And so there's a tension, but a lot of it is about relinquishing power, distributing power, which often isn't said. And if you adopted a more, instead of seeing the system as a machine, but more as a human living system with its complexities, you would actually allow for more self-organization teams, including community-based. But that means you'll need less management. And there's some wonderful examples, such as something called buurtzorg, which is community nursing in Holland, where it's very light on administration and management. But that means people have to let go of control and power. And a lot of this is what we were talking about, measurements, is about fear of something going wrong. It's about an excessive kind of focus, if you like, fear-driven focus, which creates this need to control absolutely everything and to predict everything. And one of my worries is that, I mean, Jane was saying that everything is changing. That's true. Is that AI could actually result in era 2 on steroids.
Right. Yeah.
It could. in that it will be even easier to measure, and we'll all have to be putting all this data inside, and all this data becomes so massive, and that it will be unhelpful. On the other hand, some people say that, oh, but it will be great because it will remove the need for this administration, and so there'll be more time and space for that relational care and conversations and so on. We'll see.
It's interesting you raised that, because that was a topic we discussed in a previous podcast.
Yes, it is.
And we're very mixed, outcomes from that. And I think any of us who use AI and are open-minded to it are also highly skeptical and a little in fear of what the results will be. Yeah, that's interesting you've raised that. Jens, can I go back to you, because I can see you've had your hand up there.
Yeah, there was a link to safety culture and patient safety, but also the assumption that less control is better and it works. And I notice even in myself a fear, like, if there is no control, would it actually work? Will it be fine? Do we not need something? And I see that in conversations time and again. What would we do if we would have fewer forms to fill out and et cetera, et cetera?
I was just thinking as you were talking, it is that blend, isn't it, that we need both. I always think of basket weaving or weaving in general, that you need the warp and the weft. So you need some structure. You need to be able to move in and out of, your structure, and it needs to be held loosely enough so it's got flexibility and adaptability in your fabric, resulting fabric. So I think, and that's complexity, isn't it? It's how do we pick? It isn't an either or between era 1, era 2, or era 3. I think era 3 is when we marry all of this together, that we move into a different world where we embrace complexity. We know that we don't always know. We can navigate the banks between chaos and rigidity. But as you said, Paquita, I mean, it is about relinquishing power and control, but I think it's going to happen whether we like it or not, because I think we're full of hubris and the imagining that we can control everything. But we can see, just with climate, that actually, we've had a curtain raiser with COVID, but there's more coming down the line to humble us.
I agree.
Yeah, no, I think there are elements of era 3 already, and I think it's an organic process. I agree with what's been said, really, that it's not going to be that someone waves a magic wand and we're transported there. I think it'll be hopefully an organic process, and we might not have a choice, because I think people are becoming much more empowered, and whatever you think of AI, it's certainly democratizing in that sense, that people will have much more access to information which we might kind of raise an eyebrow at, but actually it'll get better and better, won't it, in terms of accuracy. So I think this, how doctors were held up as godlike figures in era 1, there's just no place for that anymore.
Is there an argument there that actually with AI and its inherent fallibilities, that there's a chance that it might actually lionize the doctor and the individual and put more credence on the opinion of the human doctor?
No, I don't think so, James. I think that we'll have to have the humility to accept that probably we will have to defer in some way to AI in terms of the biomedicine, but our role will become much more interpretive, which we've talked about before, and that can only work in the presence of relational care and trust and etc. So I think what Jane said really resonates. Like, if we don't, we might not have a choice.
Yeah, I think we're going to need different kinds of doctors. I think what we need is to work out what makes the experience of providing that space of being an embodied human, in the consulting room. I think it was the book by Eric Topol, Deep Medicine, where he talked about just that actually we should be recruiting to provide care and compassion in those spaces, the things that the machine can't do. So if we're clever and we're wise to it, I think it's how do we marry the best of both? Because the idea that we might have a choice, I think there are plenty of people who are developing all sorts of systems and ready to step in. So I think we have to own this space, really. I've
noticed that there's been this talk here a little bit about a need for courage and a transition from fear to more trust. And I wanted to maybe just ask a little bit about that as well. And if it's demanding this sort of cultural shift away from fear and compliance towards more of a trust and a moral purpose, have you guys seen any strategies or have you seen or used any that have been effective in overcoming sort of institutionalized resistance that are built into people's practice?
I mean, I feel like because of the projects that I've been involved in, I felt like what we were doing was lighting the match, a bit like the Little Match Girl. So we were providing a vision of the future, small scale, just to say, this is what it might feel like, this is what it might taste like, and going into that experience, a bit like kids do, let's play it. It wasn't going into it saying we've got all the answers, but it's like, this isn't working, let's have a go at something else. And actually what we found is that people didn't always know quite what was going on, but they could sense in their bodies that this felt better and this felt good. And that certainly gave me the courage to do other things and not to be quite so scared. And then working with patients in that way, you know, saying that this is for all of us. It isn't just up to us to create health. It's for all of us.
Paquita, please.
Yes, no, I think they're good examples of co-creation of flourishing, if you like, which have involved trust and deepening and building relationships. So one of them is compassionate communities. And for example, Helen Kingston in Frome, and there are other examples of that. And she's going to be talking at our Replenishing Day in September. And also psychiatry, again, a community-based approach, which involves families and communities helping people with long-term mental health conditions. And so it's called the Trieste model. So there are examples. And I'm thinking that what really helps is we know that creating good teams. So I'm thinking it creates that level of trust that you know how people are going to behave, you know how much you can rely on them. So building teams, building continuity of care, or rebuilding, I should say, because a lot of that's been lost, particularly in primary care and general practice. So these are all things that help to build trust. And there's a lovely quote from Don Berwick saying, "Let joy, not fear, infuse the NHS." And it's something about, celebrating, you know, what the things that we really value and are good at, and collaborating together, forming a community of practice is what I think is the way forward. But there's been so much has been about fragmentation and disintegration, and we're really coming back to the warp and the weave that Jane was talking about.
Jane, would you tell us a little bit about some of the work you were kind of alluding to, and some of the work that you do with SAGE practices?
So SAGE practices, I guess, is a early in germination project, although actually been laying down quite deep roots in terms of creating the conditions to display something on the surface. So at the moment, there's just a website, and we're about to start an Instagram, although I feel a little bit strange about that. And it's really to showcase examples of where people are doing things differently, so that if you are a despairing clinician or patient or citizen, and you just want to know that it isn't all bad news, you know, we're there to bring good news stories and to share recipes for flourishing, but also to hold space for the grief of what we've lost and what we're losing, and to acknowledge the times that are difficult. I guess a lot of the work is coming out of a WhatsApp group that we're all part of, which has provided a really nourishing and sort of sanctuary space that you often don't have anymore in medicine once you progress beyond more junior years. So people might informally form circles or whatever, but often people are very isolated. And as Paquita said, the importance of teams and experiencing kindness and compassion, I think, is so important. I was always struck when the cuts were being made locally. I went to a meeting of GPs and all the tea, coffee and food was cut. And I just thought that was such a retrograde step.
Yeah.
We're small, but actually to show people who should be caring that you're not cared about in the most basic of ways actually was so short-sighted.
It's some of those smallest cuts that actually don't add up to much are the ones that actually have the most progressive and negative impact on the on the people they're supposed to be supporting. So yeah, I can see the short-sightedness of those cuts. I mean, come on, as well as that in the British GP practice, cutting the tea, I mean, you're going to cause a riot, aren't you, really? It's Paquita, I'd love to get you back in on this.
Just one other thing which I've been involved in and which has been shown to be successful is something called Schwartz Rounds, which again is providing a space for clinicians of all kinds to talk about the emotional and difficult aspects of their work. And sharing it. It's facilitated and it's shared with anyone who wants to come. It might be a hospice, a hospital trust, and that's been shown to improve staff well-being and to create, again, more trust and more understanding of people who are working in different disciplines. So that's another thing which has been working, and it's a small intervention in the sense that it doesn't demand much. They do provide food, and it's usually at lunchtime. So there are these green shoots that are happening in all sorts of places.
I want to bring Jens back in, but before I do, it sounds a lot like all four of you have really kind of relied upon these informal groups that you've created, and that you've created your own support systems. Is that fair to say, and is that quite important across general practice?
Yeah. This is exactly where I wanted to chip in, because on one hand, I think, well, maybe it's root system and maybe we are wheat, maybe we are green shoots, but I'm really interested to find out how could this blend in with the bigger organizations or with management structures, like official management structures that hold power, because they all have virtue statements. Everybody will go and fill out equality and diversity courses, etc., etc. Where is the way to think big or to get real and to move away from echo chambers of like-minded people who post, and then you have a green or a red heart? It's fine, it's really, really good. But for me, that's not good enough.
I couldn't agree more, Jens. I mean, I felt like towards the end of my time in practice, I was repeatedly writing to different trusts when referrals were rejected or patients were shortchanged, and just quoting back to them the mission statements and what they paint on the hoardings to hide what's going on behind the scenes. And I think, you know, that idea that we fob people off, the idea we say it and then just do something completely different. Everybody knows, you know, that you can feel it in your body when there's integrity. And that's, I guess, coming back to the idea of a moral revolution. So how do we really, you know, in a world where lots of things value what's on the surface and the bright and shiny, but not that deep and that inner work that we need to be doing?
Yeah, I totally agree, Jane, and Ru, let me take your perspective on that too.
I was actually just going to ask Jane for some examples. It sounds like you're collecting these good news stories, Jane. I'm just really interested if there's any that you think of that you could share.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot now. I mean, I could mention there's an amazing GP up in Burnley, James Fleming. So he's been working very closely with primary schools, really interested in food poverty. Burnley is actually the town where I grew up, and it's got I think it's one of the towns with the lowest life expectancy in England. And James has been working on growing projects and cooking and eating better projects with children, and really making a difference to the local area and influencing then local policy. And I just think that's so impressive. And there are pockets all over the place. I heard about a GP who, in the waiting room in Kentish Town, in a small practice during the pandemic, brought patients in. And I think people had brought cake, and so that people could talk in the waiting room. And then it turned into a jamming session. And it's been a really good way to develop relationships between the local community. And there are just so many things going on, I think. And I guess it's to quote David Bornstein, who started the Solution Focused Journalism Network, that journalists have a responsibility not just to bring us the bad news, but bring us also where there are pockets of people making a difference, or what we can do so that we don't fall easily into despair and just think there's no point and it's all awful and we maybe just have another glass of wine.
Well, that's a really good point, and we were discussing this off air slightly, so I think it might be a good point for us to kind of discuss a bit more depth here. This notion, like the negativity and the language that's often used to refer to the NHS as being broken, as a doctor, a clinician working in general practice, that must be, a horrible thing to hear, and it must be really make you feel really quite despondent. I think, Paquita, you were saying earlier that you'd experienced this recently as well, and this notion of sort of despair.
Yes. I mean, when I heard this statement and it's been repeated, my heart sunk, and I thought this is so unhelpful for all those working in health and social care, because it's demoralizing. It makes people kind of give up, and it's also invalidating of all the hard work they do. People worked so hard during the pandemic to save lives. They really put themselves at risk. They are still suffering. I think that the aftermath of that, there was a lot of moral distress and leading to moral injury, having to treat patients and their families in ways that they were counter to their values. And that hasn't really been fully acknowledged. So when you hear, the NHS is broken, and in a way I think, well, what is broken is the system. And what about talking about repair? And, I like the metaphor of kintsugi, which is, of a vase that gets broken, but a Japanese concept, but you repair it with gold between the cracks, and you make something that's more beautiful and just as useful. And we should be thinking more in that way, and thinking about what are the things that are really good that we want to retain, and what are the things that actually have not been helpful and that we can discard. So that's why I think we need to look differently. And also, it's a very deficit-based approach. It's looking at what's wrong, which is very, very almost automatic in medicine, and yet we should really be looking through the board at what is going well. What is it that's good? What is it that we need to, what are our strengths? What can we build on? And energizing people and giving them hope. Sorry, I'm quite passionate about this.
No, it's you can hear it, and it's wonderful to hear as well. No, and Jane, I feel like you've got a response here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you said, Paquita. And I guess it's about how do we activate all of us? Because I think it can feel like, things are broken and you've got to fix it. We all have to, pick up the threads and start weaving and play our small part. And that was one of the things that struck me so much at the practice, that I would see people who would come in feeling that they were broken, but I felt like I could see all this amazing potential. Mm-hmm. And because we'd started various projects where people could get involved, finding out about what people might be interested in, and then seeing them flourish when they started cooking or realized they could sew. And actually, I said I specialize in the art of possibilitation. And because I think it is all about mending, repair, renewal, regeneration, and that is at every level, on a personal, community or planetary level. That's the way we have to be thinking and shifting that culture.
Now, Jens, Ru, this is something that comes up in the book, does it not? And what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I couldn't resonate more with it. So I see my strength and my passion in being something like the repair shop.
Yeah, nice.
It works fairly well. The only problem is, how do you extrapolate this on population? And we had puppets and parcels. How do you foster this when the system is designed to be parcel force?
I think I love that African phrase. I say, Ubuntu, I am because we are. And I think that's how we should be thinking. There's too much onus. Whenever I give these kind of talks, and I have to really respond to this feeling that, well, I can't do it all. How am I meant to fix broken people and broken systems? And I think that whole conceptualization is really unhelpful. We're in this together and we're trying to help each other. And I mean, the one thing is not thinking about things as broken beyond repair. And I think, like, as clinicians, we can be quite guilty of that with patients who are suffering, who have really difficult things going on in their lives, to think of them as beyond hope. And that's when we're really in trouble, because things are very rarely beyond hope.
I'll go to Jens, but I would also like to continue this idea about patients as well, and what the role of patients and communities in this transition. But let me go to Jens and then to Paquita. Jens, please.
In the book, for example, there's one story, there's a picture of wooden stand with a leather belt, and that is something that was doomed beyond repair. And that showed the workarounds that a leather repairer made it for physio, that they can do the job privately on their own initiative because NHS procuring said, sorry, we can't do it anymore. And that relates to the spirit of the NHS, which I see all the time. Without these acts of kindness, helping, moving in, nothing would work. It does not work on targets. The problem is that all the other bits are taken for granted, but that's what keeps the system going. It's not broken, but what drives the system is not recognized. We have to be kind because the GMC tells us to be kind, yes, but that spits in the face of kindness.
Yeah, no, I think just touching on what Ru was saying, so there's very much that sort of individualized concept that we have in the West, which is unhelpful because we can't solve these problems except collectively and together. So, and I think there's also a wider issue which often is ignored, which is the social determinants of health, that a lot of the reason that, and this was brought up recently in several articles in The Guardian, that inequality is very high in this country, poverty is high. Poverty in itself is a determinant of ill health. And this, again, is to do with the economy, how the government prioritizes various things. So we can't ignore that, you know, in the healthcare is a reflection of that. And the health of the nation is a reflection of that. So if we looked more at flourishing rather than GDP, I think that would really make a big difference. And also, you know, we do need to be able to influence those who make the policies. And Jens was saying, how can we make this work so that, yes, there's a lot we can do from the ground up, but there has to be some influence on what's happening at the top, so to speak.
Any further thoughts on how we can implement that change?
Yeah, that's difficult. There are people, good people, who have the ear of some of the politicians, and I think it's working with them. And but I'm sure others have other ideas. But you know, care is so undervalued, and as Jane and Jens was saying, so much is going on that's just not even recognized, that is keeping the show on the road, so to speak. And I'm thinking of carers, you know, informal carers, formal carers, underpaid, undervalued.
I think one of the things we want to do with Sage is to showcase all the quiet heroes, to show that we're not alone and that there's lots of people out there, because I think you create a movement. And often the idea that it's top down, I think at times of transition, it's bottom up, isn't it? We know that big social movements always start from the grassroots, and you don't have to convince everybody. I think the data suggests it can be anywhere between 3 and 25% in terms of actually shifting a system. So I think, you know, remaining optimism as a political act.
Living in Arizona at the moment, I'm definitely thinking about that, and hopefully it's more like 3% rather than 25%. We have a bit of time left. There was a couple of questions I wanted to get to. One of them being about the role of patients and communities. Does anyone have any strong thoughts on that? And what's the role of the people on the other side of the stethoscope?
I guess, I mean, I feel like my last decade in practice, I was working with my patients really directly, and I've carried on doing that work. And it was one of the reasons why I ended up leaving the practice amongst a number of different things. But it was to continue what felt like health creation work out in the community. So I feel like a bit like the attachment model, where you start off holding tightly and you gradually let go in that kind of eldership way, and you move gradually outwards. That I now feel like I'm just pro bono in the community. But I work particularly with a charity called Cook for Good, who are doing astounding work, scaling deeply on an estate in King's Cross and providing a food pantry. And I do the health series there. And actually, I felt like I've done this series over the last 3 years, and that I was making more difference in a kitchen than I was in a consulting room. And people have all the ingredients they need already. And it's just about sharing our knowledge and not withholding that knowledge or power. And actually, it doesn't take a lot to actually really transform things.
Paquita, please.
I would add to that patients have so much knowledge and skills that they've acquired through their trajectory of illness. I mean, as a GP, I was so humbled by people who managed with, what would be seen as extreme disabilities to lead flourishing lives. And I've got quite a few examples of that. So I think they can offer us a lot as well. And it's being humble and recognizing that. And these compassionate communities can be different from social prescribing, because actually working alongside communities as equal partners rather than, I know social prescribing can be wonderful, but I don't like the word because it's implying we're giving this to you, we're prescribing, have a bit of this and a bit of that, rather than actually the community taking action, pretty much the lead, really.
But we are community as well, aren't we?
Yeah.
Even the vision, the idea that, yeah. And we're all just people, all just human beings at the end of the day.
Well, lastly for me then, I wanted to look a little bit about the future as well. And you're both talking about this notion of sort of burning in rather than burning out. And what does it look like for the future, for the next generation? How can we help the next generation of general practitioners burn in rather than burn out?
I guess it's providing conditions so that they can flourish. I think there's a real thing around eldership, because I do think that there's, a lot of us who have left the system early, but who aren't ready to, hang up our stethoscopes or put on our slippers. So I think it's something around how do we support the system. I've still got an honorary contract with the practice because I feel like we've been given generous pensions, even if you take it early. And so, there's possibility to contribute, because it feels better to have meaning and purpose, even beyond, the official job. And particularly once you've got to know your own people in your own patch, you care about people and you care about what happens. So you want to make a difference. So, yeah, I think there's something there. I don't quite know exactly how we can make that happen, but that's my sense anyway.
And I think it's worth highlighting that a lot of you who are transitioning into retirement are never going to fully retire, and you're always going to be involved and you're always going to be passing on, and there's that vocation. And I think that's really important to highlight for those who are listening as well, who might not be quite so familiar with that. Now, I know Jens wanted to say something, but I'll go to Paquita first, please.
Well, just to say that I think the mentoring and coaching actually can be a very useful and helpful source for people, having done it now for many, many years. And really, with clinicians who are about to leave the profession, kind of switching and recognizing what they could do and what they could offer, and actually within their patch, changing the system, getting allies and so on. So I think there's a role for that, including in medical school, having a good mentoring or coaching network, and also role models are really important. I've seen medical education, and actually the role models who are really unhelpful is actually not allowing them to be involved in teaching, being fairly ruthless. Mm-hmm. And Bob Klaber is a very inspirational. He's a pediatrician at Imperial, and he has a kindness in healthcare conversations. And he says that now, as he said, it doesn't actually take more time or money or anything to be kind. But if he sees unkindness, disrespect, and so on, he acts straight away. He doesn't allow it to just happen. So those things, but definitely providing support and nurturing. And I think actually, from point of view of moral distress and injury, is helping people to navigate those problems. And there is evidence of getting some training in ethics and understanding a bit more what, consent, confident, all these things helps people to be more resilient.
Thank you. Jens, did you have some final thoughts?
Yes, the main thought is not to believe the hype of if I care too much, I'm at risk of burning out. No, you are not. It's not the caring that is the problem. It's the culture of fear, or the fear of not being perfect, etc., etc. And I think I'm living this, that I'm not fearful of burning out, and that caring is fun. Doing things with people is fun. bring the hedonism back and not shift it out into, oh, I need to have more leisure time and more holidays to survive. No, it's in the job. It's all there, but you have to see it. You have to see it. You have to know it's there, and it's good.
It's rewarding. I remind people that compassion is a positive emotion. It's linked to the reward centers of the brain for those who like the neuroscience, and it's only empathic distress that leads to burnout. So not having those resources, but if you can be compassionate and so on, it's a deeply rewarding experience, and for you and the patient, and and it flows between people. So as Jen said, that's and all the evidence shows that that's the case. That if doctors can express their empathy and compassion, they don't burn out.
I feel like this is a good recruitment drive here today. You've really shone a nice positive light on some things. I thought this might have gone a bit more negative, but it's very, very, very constructive and positive. But before we end, I would love to go back to Ru. Ru, do you have any final thoughts today?
I think that for the next generation, for people coming through the system, it's really good to look at the whole and to kind of think, to remind yourself, what am I doing here? Why am I doing it? What's influencing me? If I'm acting in a particular way, is it because I think it's the right thing to do? Is it in line with my own values and judgment, or is there something else? If there's something else, how much weight should I give it? And kind of asking yourself these questions and not being frightened to ask yourself these questions, I think is really useful.
Jane or Paquita, do you have anything you'd like to use this platform to say finally?
I guess it's how do we start to have those conversations? And you mentioned something, Paquita, about creating more spaces for them. One of the projects that I am involved in at the moment, which came out of towards the end of my time at the practice, was trying to distill lots of the things that we might need, the good ingredients of being human, into a pack of playing cards to use them to open up those kind of conversations. And we've started to explore using them in groups with medical students and with other clinical staff and in patient groups. And I think we're unpracticed at having those type of conversations, but that's what we need to do to reroute ourselves in good values, which is why it's so exciting, all Paquita's work.
Yeah, no, I mean, talking about values, there's again a lot of evidence that if people work in organizations or systems that are congruent with their values, that then they're much more likely to flourish, to be retained, to not leave, and the opposite is true. So again, being really kind of certain about them, what they are, and where you're not going to compromise is very useful, and having the skill to be able to do that and to have the support to be able to do that is really important. So I agree, and making space for, as Jane said, making space for those conversations.
Well, on that note, thank you all very much for your time. It's been wonderful hosting you today. It's been fantastic to hear insights, and of course these experiences and these analogies. It's been wonderful to hear them. So thank you all so much. I think that's really positive, and I've certainly left this conversation feeling burned in, not burned out, I think. So thank you all, and thanks of course to everyone who's been tuning in today. And any questions, do send them in. It's been wonderful hosting and seeing you all. Thanks again for your time, and we'll catch you next time on In Conversation.